I hope you enjoyed episodes 1 and 2 of the McLaren Vale Grenache series. Up next, we've got two brilliant winemakers, Pete Fraser from Yangarra and Steve Pannell from S.C.Pannell. And I ask them to talk to each other because I'm behind the camera this time and not on it. I ask them to explain to me the longevity of the style that's now made in McLaren Vale because it's very different to the past and there's got to be a secret here. So what is it? And they tell me. I'm in McLaren Vale and I'm trying to get to the bottom of the longevity potential, aging potential of these incredibly supple and silky but tannic Grenache that are being made here in profusion actually. And I've been asking a few people, some great winemakers, Steve Pannell and Pete Fraser. So Steve Pannell from S.C.Pannell Wines and Pete Fraser from Yangarra. And the thing I thought I would do actually is mic them both up and have them tell each other and me and us what it is about these wines that makes them so age-worthy. So here we go. I asked you today about these wines. Talk to us.
Yeah, so you asked me how Grenache ages, and the best way, I suppose, is proof is in the pudding. I said I'm happy to open you the first Grenache I made in McLaren Vale, which is for Tintara, and it's the 1995 Tintara Grenache, which is there. And we made the Shiraz at the same time. And the interesting thing for me that I didn't expect when we made this wine was that the Grenache has aged better than the Shiraz. So it's caused a lot of thinking about, there was this natural propensity of most people to think that only big, rich wines age, but we know that Burgundy ages beautifully. Pommars you can drink from the 40s and 50s, no problem at all. So weight, it's not the only factor that you need to get a wine to age. And for me, with Grenaches, and Pete knows this better than anybody, the pH of Grenache is the thing that gets you when you start to make Grenache here, that the pH is very, very low. And that enables the wines to age very gently and carefully. But I don't think it's the only factor which Pete and I have been discussing.
And I think the one thing that we're seeing is the aging of fruit tannin.
Yeah.
Not oak tannin.
Yeah.
So all these wines will have one thing in common, that they're not going to have a myriad of oak tannin in them.
Yeah, and the expression, like these days we're searching for more and more tannin within our Grenaches. Naturally, the wines we make in McLaren Vale are fruit sweet. So there's a movement amongst a lot of the Grenache producers now to balance that fruit sweetness and control it. And we tend to control that by tannin. And then we tend to control that by lack of oxygen, or making the wine in a reductive state, not dissimilar to the way I suppose some people make Chardonnay. And as you do that, keep oxygen away from the wine, and it's very important with Grenache because Grenache oxidises very readily, you lose all that fruit. And so if you can keep it in as large as volume as possible and as large as oak as possible, and oak is not important, new oak isn't in Grenache, then the wine stays in this reductive sort of cocoon. And that's sort of helping the wines too. I think they age well in that way.
What's the trajectory of aging in terms of fruit characters, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we're really, how I made this one is quite different to, so I made this one in an oxidative way, and to see if this one can go, I'm very interested to see what the wines that both of us are making these days, as we've got better vineyards, as we're growing better. I mean, this year we were seeing fruit where pHs had not even hit 3 when the thing is totally ripe. So these wines will age incredibly well, and I don't think there'll be a problem with them all. The interesting point is I don't think it ages, unlike Nebbiolo, that they start out fine and pretty and tight, and they get sweetness and density and darkness and depth as you're going along. And we were looking at my 12, and I'm quite surprised that wine's got more layers now than it ever had, and more complexity now than it ever had. And you sort of start to see that regional characteristic coming through of McLaren Vale, where because we're under the sea, there's almost like this iodine, briny seaweed character about McLaren Vale. This is the 12. And so, yes, I think this is probably a better indication of how we'll age in time.
I'd like to think too that a lot of that clay layer that sits in the depths of Clarendon is all that orangey ferrous clay. So hopefully you're getting that iron coming through that's giving you that seaweedy, ferrousy kind of character. But it's interesting to see, this is a classic how the tannins, I hadn't tried this wine before, and the grittiness of the tannin
Yeah.
And we talked today about, it doesn't get talked enough about with Grenache, the shape of these wines and the length of these wines, and there's so much to be explored that conversation happens in Burgundy and in Nebbiolos and Barolo. I think it's so exciting to see how these wines are evolving.
We've just limited the varietal discussion to fruit and flavour and smell. We haven't taken it to tannin. And when you drink Nebbiolo, because when you start drinking it, it's a very confronting thing and you go, why do I like this? And for me, if I remove the tannin from Nebbiolo, what am I left with? So it becomes the most important part of what you're trying to get in wine. And then you talk about each variety having its own tannin structure. Shiraz is not a particularly tannic variety, I don't think. Cabernet is much more tannic and Grenache is more tannic. So, and tannin is a preservative. So it makes sense with low pH and good tannin and reductive made and screw caps that work. These wines will age beautifully well for 20 or 30 or 40 years.
And they are tannic. They're very fine. And I think that really defines the style that you're proliferating here, that they have got very, very fine but omnipresent tannins.
I mean, because we want people to drink these with food, and the tannin, too much sweetness, too much, you would never cook like that. If you've got something that's sweet and ripe and rich, you don't add sugar and you don't make it riper, you do things to control that. And so for all of us, it's very important now to get that finesse and balance and tightness in these wines. And because Grenache oxidises, it's sort of forced us down this way to go, this is the way we want these wines to be.
For me too, I think that we're probably becoming more and more aware of time on skins and gentle handling, but just getting that gentle steeping versus extracting it like coffee.
I think Giles called it tea, not coffee.
Yeah, totally. And it's that gentle, and that's taken from a South African winemaker who's in Prerat in South Africa, Eben Sadie, who's that classic little line about, I'm making tea, not coffee. And it's interesting, like I brought a 15 that's been made in ceramic egg, and we were having a conversation about that some people think of that wine as, in these ceramic, that they oxidative, they are if they're terracotta. The beauty of ceramic is because it's cooked at a higher temperature, it doesn't have the same porosity. So provided you seal the container properly, you get this beautiful anaerobic kind of non-oxidative. It's a bit the same with the large vats. The thing that they've all got is thick staves, meaning you're getting very slow oxygen transfer. But it's interesting, this wine, I still feel like this also has an incredibly low pH, and it's nearly a bit angry as a young wine, and it has this, and when they're like that, they nearly have that tension to them, that raciness. But I was curious to see how, I think it's only going to keep growing, and that fruit sweetness that we talked about, that it maybe doesn't have right yet.
No,
it might be in 10, 15 years' time.
Just take its time.
And how they bend. So,
Steve, while you're doing that, can you tell us about the high volumes of Grenache in bigger?
Yeah, I was glad, because I think the most seminal moment, I started mucking around with these Grenaches at Tintara. We did a tour through the Chateau Neuf and looked at a lot of people, and I can remember going Beaucastel, and I was still struggling with trying to get the perfume in and the shape and the tightness of the wines. And so they said to me, when I'd made that Tintara, I sort of press it off, make it like Shiraz, put it in a barrel, let it have oxygen while it's going through Malo. But they said to me, oh no, we age our wine in stainless steel tanks in large volumes and keep air away from it. And it's like someone switched a light on. So I came back straight away and started to keep these wines in as big a volume as possible. And all of a sudden, perfume came, elegance came, finesse came, delicacy came. And it was like, from that's the most important moment for me in making Grenache. From there, we started to buy larger old botte and large old vats. And so we use those these days to age them in, for us, the minimum size for a Grenache is 2,500 litres, about 300 dozen. And then that just makes a totally different wine. This finesse and elegance, which we're looking for, is alive and well.
Pete, I just want to ask you one more question before we go, and that is around your comments on the 2011 vintage and what the climatic conditions kind of compelled you all to sort of do.
It was, and especially towards the colder part of McLaren Vale and Grenache being generally slightly later ripening.
A La Nina year.
in a very wet year. It's the wettest year I've ever experienced. My birth year was the previous wettest. So winemakers of our era have not really experienced anything like it. It rained. I remember doing a bit of a look at leaf wetness, and they were wet for like 6 weeks. It just didn't stop. And even when it did stop, the moisture, humidity was up, and so the canopy never dried out. And we were forced to be picking at 12s, 12 and a halves, and acidity with and botrytis is exponential. So you're kind of like,
it's a bad variety for botrytis.
And you've got very tight bunches, and bush vines, and it's close to the ground. So when the water's hitting, it's splashing up, and we were able to make these beautiful framed wines that had a real finesse and elegance and beauty to them. And to be honest, probably for us as a winery, I think it was a turning point for us. One, in the style of wines that we made, but also being noticed, because you're kind of pounding away doing your stuff, and it nearly takes a vintage like that to come to get noticed. And but that then set wheels in motion that we could do these little things. And I would say it's still continuing is a something that, like, Steve and I actually call each other at the beginning of vintage, and where are you at, and how they moving, and what are they looking like? Have you started? Because Grenache has probably one of the narrowest windows, and it's sometimes scary because it's, and Steve says it more than anyone, when it tastes right, you've missed it. And it's so true. You're you're probably 2 weeks before when it tastes right.
Yeah.
And you're looking at sometimes scary pHs that are, sometimes below 3. And 2022 was an example like that. So
2022 was?
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. And so that wine, the 13 and the 15 that I brought along were really classic, very low pH years. And it's interesting, you can get away with a little bit more for the kind of more bistro early drinking styles where you can push it out a bit, but you lose the tannin, the beauty and the frame.
You lose a level of wine. I mean, we're trying to make beautiful, great wine.
Yeah.
And I think that's these old
at
vineyards.
That level, and these older vineyards, to do it justice, sometimes you can have a picking window of 3 days to know you really nailed it. Yeah. And I would say we're constantly, like 2018, was probably a tricky vintage where you've got this heat and, probably not the greatest wines out of McLaren Vale. They were big and kind of blocky and what have you. And sometimes, these cool years, the 17s and
they're easier to make.
They're so much easier because that window's kind of a little bit more generous.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say definitely Grenache is my hardest thing to make, and the hardest thing to do with it is pick it. Yeah. Because it's like it can just jump on you,
and
like all of a sudden.
The yields are low.
Yeah.
The vines are low to the ground. It takes you twice as long to pick what a normal block would to pick. So consequently, what you might get across a trellis vine with hand pickers, you probably only pick quarter to a half in that same day. Yeah. So you kind of have all these extra challenges.
Yeah. There we go. We still love it.
We still love it, and we're planting. I think one thing that we didn't talk about is the future, and of the planting. We're both planting vineyards. We're fortunate to plant some 15 years ago, and we're now we're kind of sitting waiting with some orders in play because we'd like to kind of add to ours with a little bit more diversity.
Diversity.
I'm not saying that those clones may be any better than what we've got, but I feel like we're not doing ourselves the right justice if we just keep doing what we've got. Yep. So for us, I feel like it's worth exploring. But we have to be careful in that too, because there are smaller buried clones that are talked about in the old world as being better, but will they ripen too quickly, or will they give us too much tannin or extract? So there's all these little things that we've got to dip our toe in the water and see kind of how they'll work to our site, and not just blindly copy because somebody said it over the other side of the world it is better. So it's an exciting time, and then exciting, finding homes for those young vines. We're starting to see those 15-year-old young vines just starting to show the levels of depth and complexity to be useful. So it's a bit of a commitment.
There's a massive shortage of Grenache. McLaren Vale, we've only got less than 6% of all the vines. Yeah. So it's not a lot, and the old vineyards are very rare. What were you saying? 75 hectares of...
75 hectares of vines 70 years and older.
And in terms of price per tonne, how is that tracking?
It's the most expensive grape in McLaren Vale now. Yeah, which is like, proof's in the pudding.
But the great part is that takes, I suppose, people that aren't serious about it. And I think as a region, one of our next steps too is to collectively work to continue to better the breed and continue to push ourselves as, hopefully the leaders around the world in this variety with our own distinctive, unique expression of site and variety.
Yeah, true.
Cheers.
Pleasure.
No worries.
Thank you.